The morning frost covered everything like a white blanket when Clara McKenna stepped outside their small wooden cabin. Her breath came out in small clouds as she looked across their failed wheat field. The crops had died months ago, leaving nothing but dry, cracked earth that stretched toward the gray Nebraska sky. Inside the cabin, she could hear her father coughing again. That terrible, deep cough that seemed to shake his whole body. Thomas McKenna had been fighting this sickness for almost 6 months now, and Clara knew he was losing the battle. The doctor in town had been honest with them. Her father's lungs were giving out, and there wasn't much time left. Clara pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the barn. Their old horse, Dusty, was the only animal they had left. They'd sold everything else just to buy food and medicine. The cow, the chickens, even her mother's china plates, all gone to pay for things that couldn't save her father anyway. She patted Dusty's neck and whispered, "We're going to take a long trip, old friend. Just you, me, and Papa." The horse seemed to understand, nuzzling against her hand with his soft nose. Back inside the cabin, Clara found her father sitting up in bed, trying to catch his breath after another coughing fit. His face was pale and thin, so different from the strong man who used to work on the railroad. Thomas McKenna had built this homestead with his own hands, dreaming of a better life for his daughter. Now those dreams lay as dead as the wheat in their field. "Clara, girl," he said in a weak voice, "maybe it's time we talked about what comes next." She sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand. It felt so light, like bird bones. "We're going to Oregon, Papa." "To Aunt Ruth's place?" "She wrote that they have good doctors there, and the air is clean and fresh." Thomas shook his head slowly. "That's more than 800 miles, child. I'm not sure I can make it to the next county, let alone Oregon." "Don't talk like that," Clara said firmly. "We McKennas don't give up. You taught me that." Her father smiled, the same gentle smile she remembered from her childhood. "Your mama would be proud of how strong you've grown. But Clara, you need to think about yourself too. You're only 23? You have your whole life ahead of you." Clara squeezed his hand. "My life is taking care of you. That's what family does." The next morning, Clara began preparing for their journey. She sold their furniture to old Mr. Henderson from the neighboring farm. The rocking chair her father had made, the dining table where they'd shared so many meals, even her mother's sewing machine. Everything went for whatever coins people could spare. "You're making a terrible mistake," Mrs. Peterson from down the road told her. "Taking a dying man across the plains in winter. It's plain foolishness. He'll die out there, and likely you too." Clara kept packing supplies into their small wagon. "He's going to die here anyway. At least in Oregon, he might have a chance. And what if he doesn't make it? What if you get caught in a blizzard? What if Indians find you? A young woman alone out there." Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "It's not natural. Women shouldn't be doing such things." But Clara had made up her mind. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights working out every detail. They had enough food for about 3 weeks if they were careful. She had her father's old rifle and knew how to use it. Most importantly, she had a map showing the route to Oregon and the locations of trading posts along the way. The hardest part was building the travois, a kind of stretcher that would drag behind Dusty. She used poles from their fence and canvas from old grain sacks. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep her father off the hard ground and give him a place to rest during their long journey. On the morning they left, Thomas was having a good day. His coughing was lighter, and he could sit up without help. Clara helped him into his warmest clothes and wrapped him in every blanket they owned. "Are you sure about this, daughter?" he asked as she helped him onto the travois. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied, though her heart was beating fast with fear. As they pulled away from their homestead, Clara didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Looking back might make her change her mind, and changing her mind would mean watching her father die in that cold, empty cabin. The first day was harder than she'd expected. Dusty wasn't young anymore, and pulling the travois slowed him down. They only covered about 10 miles before Clara decided to stop for the night. She set up their small tent and made a fire, cooking beans and hardtack for their dinner. That night, lying in the tent listening to her father's difficult breathing, Clara wondered if Mrs. Peterson had been right. Maybe this was foolishness. Maybe she was just a stubborn girl who didn't know when to accept defeat, but then she remembered something her father had told her years ago, when her mother was dying of fever. Sometimes, Clara girl, the only thing you can do is keep fighting. Even when you know you might lose, you keep fighting because that's what love means. The second day brought their first real challenge. Dark clouds gathered in the west, and by afternoon, snow began to fall. Not the gentle flakes of early winter, but thick, heavy snow that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Clara tied a rope around her waist and connected it to Dusty's bridle. This way, even if she couldn't see him, she wouldn't lose him in the storm. The travois left deep tracks in the snow, and she could hear her father coughing more often as the cold air hit his lungs. "We need to find shelter," Thomas called out weakly. Clara squinted through the falling snow, but couldn't see anything except white. No trees, no buildings, nothing. They were completely alone on the vast Nebraska plains with a blizzard closing in around them. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant dying. Her feet were numb inside her boots, and ice formed on her eyelashes. Behind her, she could hear her father's breathing becoming more labored. "Just a little further, Papa," she called back to him. "We'll find somewhere warm soon." But as the snow got deeper and the wind got stronger, Clara began to wonder if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Out here in this white wilderness, with her father getting sicker and no help for miles, she felt smaller than she'd ever felt before. Still, she kept walking. Because sometimes, when you love someone enough, you keep walking even when you don't know where you're going. Even when you're scared? Even when everyone tells you it's impossible. That night, huddled in their tent while the wind howled outside, Clara held her father's hand and promised him they would make it to Oregon. She promised, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself anymore. 3 weeks had passed since Clara and her father left their Nebraska homestead. The days had blurred together into a rhythm of walking, resting, and caring for Thomas, who seemed to grow weaker with each mile they traveled. Clara's hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and her boots had worn thin, but she kept pushing forward toward Oregon. It was on a crisp morning when she first noticed him. A lone rider on horseback, maybe half a mile behind them, moving at the same slow pace they were. At first, Clara thought it might be her imagination. The endless plains could play tricks on your eyes, making you see things that weren't there. But when she looked back an hour later, the rider was still there. Fear crept up her spine like cold fingers. Out here in the middle of nowhere, a strange man following them could mean trouble. She'd heard stories about bandits who preyed on travelers, especially women traveling alone. Clara checked her father's rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Papa," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm him, "there's someone following us." Thomas raised his head from the travois and squinted into the distance. His eyesight wasn't as good as it used to be, but he could make out the dark shape on horseback. "How long has he been there?" "I first saw him this morning." "He keeps his distance, but he's definitely following us." Thomas nodded slowly. Even sick as he was, his mind was still sharp. Could be nothing. Could be someone heading the same direction we are. But Clara, you keep that rifle close, you hear me? For the next 2 days, the mysterious rider stayed. With them, sometimes he was closer, sometimes further away, but he never disappeared completely. Clara would catch glimpses of him when they crested a hill or crossed an open meadow. He was always there, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. The strange thing was, he never tried to approach them. If this man meant them harm, wouldn't he have made his move by now? Instead, he seemed content to just follow, maintaining that same careful distance. Clara began to wonder if maybe he was just a lone traveler who felt safer following their trail rather than traveling completely alone. On the 4th day of being followed, disaster struck. Dark clouds had been building all morning, and by noon the temperature had dropped so fast that Clara could see her breath in thick white puffs. The wind picked up, howling across the plains like a living thing. "Storm's coming," Thomas said from the travois. His voice was weaker than usual, and Clara noticed he'd been coughing up blood that morning. Within an hour, the storm hit with a fury that took Clara's breath away. Snow came down so thick she couldn't see Dusty's head, even though she was walking right beside him. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over, and the cold cut through her coat like it was made of paper. Clara tied herself to Dusty with rope and kept walking, but she knew they were in serious trouble. In weather like this, a person could freeze to death in minutes. Her father, already weak from his illness, wouldn't last long in this blizzard. "Clara!" Thomas called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We need shelter, now!" But there was nothing around them except open plains. No trees, no buildings, no caves. Just endless white snow and howling wind. Clara felt panic rising in her chest. After everything they'd been through, were they going to die out here in this storm? She was stumbling through a snowdrift when she heard it, the sound of a horse approaching through the blizzard. Her heart raced. The mysterious rider was finally making his move. Clara reached for her rifle with numb fingers, but before she could draw it, a voice called out through the storm. "Ma'am! There's shelter up ahead, follow me." The voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded concerned, almost desperate. Clara could barely make out the shape of horse and rider through the snow, but she didn't have much choice. Stay here and freeze, or trust this stranger who'd been following them for days. "Can you hear me?" the voice called again. "There's an old line shack about 200 yards north. Follow my voice." Clara made her decision. She grabbed Dusty's bridle and started following the sound of the man's voice. Each step was a struggle through the deep snow, as she could hear her father's labored breathing from the travois behind them. The line shack turned out to be a small, crude building made of logs and mud. It wasn't much to look at, but it had walls and a roof, which was more than they'd had a few minutes ago. The stranger was already dismounting from his horse when Clara arrived, and she got her first good look at him. He was older than she'd expected, maybe in his 30s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. His clothes were worn but clean, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Most importantly, he didn't seem threatening at all. In fact, he looked genuinely worried about their situation. "Name's Ben Morrison," he said, helping Clara get Dusty and the travois under the small overhang beside the shack. "Been watching you folks for a few days. Didn't want to intrude, but when I saw this storm coming, I knew you'd need help." Clara was too cold and tired to be suspicious anymore. "I'm Clara McKenna. This is my father." Ben looked at Thomas, who was barely conscious on the travois, and his expression grew serious. "He doesn't look good. Let's get him inside where it's warm." Together they carried Thomas into the line shack. It was small and dark, but Ben quickly got a fire going in the old stone fireplace. The warmth felt like heaven after hours in the freezing wind. Clara knelt beside her father, checking his pulse and breathing. Both were weak but steady. "You've been following us?" Clara said, finally able to think clearly now that they were safe. Ben nodded, stirring something in a pot over the fire. "I have. Didn't mean to frighten you. Truth is, I've been traveling alone for months, and when I saw you two out there, well..." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "It reminded me of something from my own past. Figured you might need help, even if you didn't know it yet." "What do you mean?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Lost my own father a few years back. Watched him die slow, just like yours is doing. I was young and stupid. Then thought I could handle everything on my own. By the time I realized I needed help, it was too late." Clara looked at this stranger who'd probably saved their lives. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." "Maybe that's exactly why," Ben said quietly. "Sometimes it's easier to help strangers than to help yourself." As the storm raged outside, Ben shared his food with them and tended to their horse. He didn't ask many questions, and he didn't try to tell Clara what she should or shouldn't be doing. He just helped, quietly and efficiently, like helping was the most natural thing in the world. Thomas woke up near midnight, looking around the unfamiliar cabin with confusion. When Clara explained what had happened, her father studied Ben carefully. "You saved us," Thomas said in his weak voice. Ben shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Not everyone. Thank you." As Clara listened to the Wind howling outside, she realized something had changed. For the first time since leaving Nebraska, she didn't feel completely alone. The storm lasted 2 full days. During that time, Clara learned more about Ben Morrison than she'd learned about any person in years. Not because he talked a lot, he was actually a man of few words, but because of how he acted when he thought. No one was watching. She noticed how he always made sure her father had the warmest spot by the fire. How he gave Thomas the larger portion of food without saying anything about it. How he stayed awake during the night, quietly tending the fire so they wouldn't wake up cold. These weren't the actions of a dangerous man. These were the actions of someone who understood what it meant to care about people. On the second morning, when the wind finally died down and the snow stopped falling, Thomas was having one of his better days. He could sit up on his own and even managed to eat some of the hot soup Ben had made from dried beef and wild onions he'd found in his saddlebags. "So where are you headed, Ben?" Thomas asked, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Ben was cleaning his rifle by the fire, a daily habit that spoke of years spent on the frontier. "Nowhere in particular. Been drifting since I lost my ranch 2 years ago." "Lost your ranch?" Clara asked, curious despite herself. Ben's hand stopped moving on the rifle for just a moment. "Bad drought, just like you folks had. Couldn't pay the bank what I owed. They took everything, the land, the cattle, even my father's old saddle." He resumed cleaning the gun, but Clara could see the pain in his eyes. "After that, I just started writing. Figured I'd keep moving until I found something worth stopping for." Thomas leaned forward, interested. "What kind of ranch was it? Cattle mostly?" "Had about 200 head and some good grazing land in Colorado Territory. Water was clean, grass was thick, and the winters weren't too harsh. It was good land." Ben's voice grew soft with memory. "My father and I built that place from nothing. Spent 15 years making it into something special." "What happened to your father?" Clara asked. Gently, Ben was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear Dusty snorting and pawing at the snow, eager to get moving again. Finally, Ben spoke. "He got sick like yours is now, but I was too proud, too stubborn to ask for help. Thought I could take care of him and run the ranch. All by myself. By the time I realized I couldn't do it alone, the debts had piled up too high, and he was too far gone." Ben looked directly at Clara. "He died in debt, knowing his life's work was going to be sold to strangers. I've carried that guilt ever since." Thomas reached out and put his thin hand on Ben's arm. "Son, we all make mistakes when we're trying to do right by the people we love. The important thing is what we learn from those mistakes." Something passed between the two men in that moment, an understanding that only comes from shared experience. Clara watched them and felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of her father's care all alone. But here was someone who understood that weight, who carried it himself. When they finally left the line shack, Ben didn't ride away as Clara had expected. Instead, he quietly began traveling with them. He didn't ask permission or make any big announcements about it. He just packed up his gear, helped Clara get Thomas settled on the travois, and started riding alongside them. At first, Clara felt awkward about it. She'd been alone with her father for so long that having someone else around felt strange. But Ben had a way of making himself useful without getting in the way. He would ride ahead to scout the trail, hunt for fresh meat to supplement their dwindling supplies, and help with the heavy work of setting up camp each night. More importantly, he was good for her father. Thomas seemed to grow stronger with Ben around, as if having another man to talk to gave him something to live for. In the evenings, while Clara tended to their gear and prepared meals, she would listen to the two men share stories by the campfire. Ben told them about his years as a cowboy, riding with cattle drives from Texas to Kansas. Thomas shared memories of working on the railroad, helping to build the great iron roads that connected the country. They talked about the land they'd both loved and lost, about dreams that had turned to dust, and about the hope that maybe, somewhere ahead, there might be new dreams waiting. One evening, about a week after they'd left the line shack, Ben brought down a rabbit with his rifle. As Clara prepared it for cooking, she realized how much their situation had improved since he'd joined them. They were eating better, traveling safer, and her father was in better spirits than he'd been since they left Nebraska. "Clara," Thomas said that night as they sat around their small fire, "I want to talk to you about something." She looked up from the rabbit stew she was stirring. "What is it, Papa?" "I want to talk about what happens when I'm gone." "Papa, don't. Listen to me, girl. I'm dying. We all know it. The question is, what are you going to do with your life after I'm gone?" Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "I don't want to think about that." "Well, I do. I think about it every day." Thomas looked across the fire at Ben, who was politely pretending not to listen while he cleaned his boots. "Ben, I'd like to ask you something." Ben looked up, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into such a personal conversation. "What would you do if you had a second chance? If you could get your ranch back, would you take it?" Ben considered the question carefully. "I suppose I would. But that's not possible. The bank sold my land years ago." Thomas smiled, the first real smile Clara had seen from him in months. But what if it was possible? What if there was other land, good land, waiting for someone who knew how to work it? "Papa, what are you talking about?" Clara asked. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This came in the mail just before we left Nebraska. From the government land office. There's still homestead land available in Colorado Territory. Good land with water rights and everything." Ben leaned forward, interested despite himself. "Where in Colorado?" "Near a place called Cedar Creek. The letter says it's got good soil, plenty of water, and it's close enough to Denver that a man could sell cattle or crops when he needed to." Thomas looked at his daughter. "Clara, what if instead of going to Oregon to live off your aunt's charity, you built something of your own?" Clara stared at her father. "Papa, I don't know anything about ranching, but Ben does," Thomas said quietly. "And Ben, you know about taking care of sick folks because you've been taking care of me and Clara both, whether you realize it or not." The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Finally, Ben spoke. "It's a nice dream, Thomas. But dreams don't always work out the way we hope they will." Thomas nodded. "No, they don't. But sometimes when one dream dies, it makes room for a better one to grow." That night, as Clara lay in her bedroll listening to her father's labored breathing, she found herself thinking about Colorado Territory and wondering if maybe, just maybe, there really could be something better waiting for them than just the end of a long, sad journey. 2 weeks after Thomas had shared his idea about Colorado Territory, everything changed. They had been making good progress across the plains, covering nearly 15 miles a day with Ben's help. The weather had been kind to them, and Thomas seemed to be holding his own. Clara had even begun to hope that maybe her father would make it to wherever they decided to go. Then came the morning when Thomas couldn't get up. Clara woke to find her father lying still on the travois, his breathing shallow and quick. His skin had a gray color that made her stomach twist with fear. When she touched his forehead, it was burning hot with fever. "Papa?" she whispered, but Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were closed, and his breathing sounded like he was drowning. Ben was beside them in seconds, taking one look at Thomas before his face grew serious. "How long has he been like this?" "I don't know. He was fine when we went to sleep last night." Clara's voice shook. "Ben, what's happening to him?" Ben knelt beside the travois and listened to Thomas's breathing. "His lungs are filling up with fluid. It happens sometimes with the consumption." He looked at Clara with gentle but honest eyes. "Clara, we need to talk." They moved away from the travois so Thomas couldn't hear them, though he seemed too sick to understand anything anyway. Ben took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. A gesture Clara had learned meant he was thinking hard about something difficult. "How bad is it?" Clara asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "It's bad. This is what my father went through near the end. Once the fluid starts building up in the lungs like this, well..." Ben trailed off, not wanting to say what they both knew. Clara felt like someone had punched her in the chest. How long? Could be days. Could be weeks if he fights it. But Clara, he's not going to get better. This is the beginning of the end. She sat down hard on a nearby rock, suddenly feeling like her legs wouldn't hold her up anymore. For months, she'd known this day would come, but knowing something and living it are two very different things. What do I do? She whispered. Ben sat down beside her. You do what you've been doing. You love him, and you make sure he knows it. And you think about what he told us that night by the fire. About Colorado? About building something of your own instead of just surviving on someone else's charity. Ben picked up a handful of dirt and let it run through his fingers. Clara, your father is a wise man. He knows his time is short, and he's trying to make sure you have a future that's worth living. That day, they barely traveled 5 miles. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out for Clara's mother, sometimes just lying quietly with his eyes closed. Clara walked beside the travois, holding his hand whenever he was awake enough to know she was there. That evening, as Ben made camp and prepared their simple dinner, Thomas had one of his clear moments. His fever had broken temporarily, and his eyes were focused and alert. Clara, come here, he said in a voice that was weak but steady. She knelt beside him, taking his thin hand in both of hers. I'm here, Papa. I need to tell you some things. While I still can. Thomas looked past her to where Ben was tending their small fire. Ben, you come over here too. This concerns both of you. Ben approached reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with being included in such a personal moment, but Thomas insisted. Sit down, son. What I have to say affects your future too, if you'll let it. Thomas struggled to sit up, and Clara helped him. Lean against the pack. The effort left him breathing hard, but his eyes were bright with purpose. Clara, I've been thinking about what I told you about the land in Colorado. I wasn't just talking to hear myself speak. I've got money saved up. Not much, but enough to buy supplies and get started on a homestead. Clara stared at her father. Papa, what money? We spent everything we had just getting this far. Thomas smiled weakly. Not everything. Before your mother died, she made me promise to always keep something hidden away for emergencies. I've got almost $300 sewn into the lining of my coat. It's yours when I'm gone. $300 was more money than Clara had ever seen at one time. It was enough to buy land, supplies, even livestock if they were careful with it. But Papa, that money should go to your medical care. Maybe if we get to a real doctor, Clara. Thomas's voice was firm despite his weakness. Listen to me, I'm dying. No doctor is going to change that, but you're not dying. You're 23 years old, and you've got your whole life ahead of you. Don't waste it grieving for an old man who's already lived his time. Ben shifted uncomfortably. Thomas, maybe I should leave you two alone to talk about this. No, Thomas turned to look at Ben directly. You're part of this conversation because I want you to be part of the plan. Ben, you know about raising cattle and working land. Clara knows about keeping house and managing money. Together, you could build something good on that Colorado land. Clara felt her cheeks grow hot. Papa, you can't just decide things like that for people. I'm not deciding anything for anyone. I'm just saying what I see. Thomas looked back and forth between Clara and Ben. I see two people who've been hurt by life but haven't let it make them bitter. I see a man who knows how to work hard and a woman who knows how to fight for what matters. And I see the way you two look at each other when you think nobody's watching. Clara felt like her face was on fire. Was it that obvious? She'd tried so hard to keep her growing feelings for Ben hidden, focusing only on taking care of her father. But apparently Thomas had noticed anyway. Ben cleared his throat. Thomas, with respect, I don't think this is the time or place for such talk. When is the right time? Thomas asked, his voice growing weaker again. When I'm dead and buried and Clara is sitting in her aunt's parlor in Oregon, wondering what might have been? When you're drifting from town to town, still running from the guilt of losing your father's ranch? The three of them sat in silence for a long moment. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear coyotes calling to each other across the dark plains. Finally, Thomas spoke again, so quietly they had to lean in to hear him. I know I'm asking a lot. I know you both have reasons to be scared of taking chances, but sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. He reached into his coat with shaking hands and pulled out a folded paper. This is the information about the Colorado land. Good soil, plenty of water, and it's only 40 miles from Denver. A man could run cattle there, or grow crops, or both. Ben took the paper and studied it by the firelight. Clara watched his face, trying to read his expression. After a long moment, he looked up. It's good land, he said simply. If a person was looking to start over, this would be a fine place to do it. Thomas smiled. Then think about it. Both of you. Think about what it would mean to build something together instead of just surviving alone. That night, as Clara lay in her bedroll listening to her father's difficult breathing, she found herself thinking not about Oregon and her aunt's charity, but about Colorado territory and the possibility of a home that would truly be hers. Thomas McKenna passed away on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising over the Colorado plains. He went peacefully, holding Clara's hand while Ben kept watch nearby. His last words were simple and clear. Be happy, daughter. That's all I ever wanted for you. Clara sat beside her father's still form for a long time, not crying, not speaking, just holding his hand as it grew cold. She felt empty inside, like someone had hollowed her out with a spoon. For months, caring for her father had been her entire world. Now that world had ended, and she didn't know what came next. Ben gave her all the time she needed. He took care of Dusty, organized their supplies, and found a good spot on a small hill overlooking a valley where wildflowers grew in thick patches. When Clara was finally ready, he helped her prepare her father for burial. They wrapped Thomas in his best blanket and laid him to rest under a tall oak tree. Ben carved a simple marker from a piece of wood, writing, Thomas McKenna, beloved father. He fought the good fight. Clara placed wildflowers on the grave and said a quiet prayer. He was a good man, Ben said softly as they stood beside the fresh grave. He was the best man I ever knew, Clara replied. He never gave up, even when everything seemed hopeless. That evening they made camp a short distance from the gravesite. Clara couldn't bring herself to leave her father just yet. She needed one more night to say goodbye properly. As they sat by their small fire, Ben pulled out the paper Thomas had given them about the Colorado land. Clara, I know this isn't the right time to talk about the future, but your father made me promise something before he died. She looked up from the fire where she'd been staring at the flames. What kind of promise? He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you didn't give up on the idea of the Colorado land. He said it was important to him that you build something of your own instead of just surviving. Clara felt fresh tears coming. Even in his final moments, her father had been thinking about her future. I don't know if I can do it, Ben. Building a homestead, running a ranch, I don't know anything about that kind of life. Ben moved closer to the fire, his face serious in the flickering light. Clara, can I tell you something? When I lost my ranch, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never amount to anything again. But these past weeks, traveling with you and your father, helping you both, it's made me remember what it feels like to have a purpose. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe your father was right. Maybe we could build something good together. Ben looked directly at her. I'm not talking about charity or pity. I'm talking about partnership. You've got the money to buy supplies and livestock. I've got the knowledge to work the land and raise cattle. Together we might actually make it work. Clara studied Ben's face in the firelight. Over the past month, she'd watched him care for her father with the gentleness of a son. She'd seen him hunt for food when their supplies ran low, tend their horses when they were tired, and keep watch during dangerous nights so she could sleep safely. He was a good man, maybe even a great man, and she'd be lying if she said she hadn't developed feelings for him, but was that enough to build a life on? Ben, what if it doesn't work? What if we get to Colorado and the land isn't as good as the paper says? What if we can't make it profitable? What if... She paused, afraid to voice her deepest fear. What if we try to build something together and end up ruining our friendship? Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Those are all good questions, Clara, and I can't promise you answers to any of them. What I can promise is that I'll work harder than I've ever worked in my life to make it succeed. And if it fails, it won't be because I didn't give it everything I had. The next morning, Clara woke early and walked up to her father's grave. She sat beside the wooden marker Ben had made and talked to her father the way she used to when he was alive. "Papa, I'm scared," she said quietly. "All my life you were there to help me make the big decisions. Now I have to make the biggest decision of my life, and I don't know what to do." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree, and for just a moment, Clara felt like her father was listening. She remembered something he'd told her years ago when she was afraid to start school. Courage isn't about not being scared, Clara girl. Courage is about doing what's right even when you are scared. When she walked back down the hill, she found Ben packing up their camp. He looked up when he saw her approaching. "I've made my decision," Clara said, her voice stronger than it had been since her father died. Ben stopped packing and gave her his full attention. "I want to try the Colorado land. Not because I think it will be easy, and not because I'm not scared. I want to try it because my father believed it was possible. And because ... She took a deep breath. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Ben Morrison. And I'd rather take a chance on building something beautiful than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Ben's face broke into the first real smile she'd seen from him since her father had gotten sick. "Claire McKenna, are you proposing to me?" Despite everything, Clara found herself laughing. "I suppose I am, in a way. Are you accepting?" "I've been hoping you'd ask," Ben said, and then he was kissing her. Gentle and sweet beside their little campfire on the Colorado plains, 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of the house Ben had built with his own hands on their homestead near Cedar Creek. It wasn't a big house, just 3 rooms and a front porch, but it was solid and warm and completely theirs. From where she stood, she could see their small herd of cattle grazing in the valley below, and beyond that, the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the house. It hadn't been easy. They'd faced late spring blizzards, sick cattle, and more hard work than either of them had imagined. But they'd also discovered something wonderful. They made a good team. Ben's knowledge of ranching combined with Clara's practical sense and careful money management had created something neither of them could have built alone. As she watched Ben riding back from checking on the cattle, Clara thought about her father and the choice he'd encouraged her to make. Thomas McKenna had been right. Sometimes the biggest risk wasn't taking chances. It was letting fear keep you from living the life you were meant to live. That evening, as she and Ben sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since her mother died years ago. She felt like she was home. "Do you think your father would approve?" Ben asked, following her gaze toward the small cemetery plot they'd established on a hill overlooking their land. Clara smiled, thinking of the wooden cross that marked where they'd reburied Thomas after bringing his remains to their new home. "I think he'd say we're exactly where we're supposed to be." And for the first time since that long journey began, Clara McKenna Morrison knew in her heart that everything was going to be all right.